The topic of this talk is take the confusion out of the use of Gen AI, and specifically in the context of a movement analysis project that we do in the class. And so students know that these tools exist. And they're wondering what is kind of the best way to make use of these Gen AI tools or generative AI, or like Gemini, ChatGPT, and so on, in a way that is acceptable in the university setting. So over here, in the beginning of the project, you can see that we encourage them to use Gen AI to explore topics, or in other words, brainstorm. And so this project actually is maybe, it's less of a significant part of this project, but we also do a different project, and so I'm sidetracking just for a second to a different project. And it's a project that is called the mini experiments, and those are pilot studies, and the students need to choose what they're going to investigate. And for making that choice, Gen AI can become a really powerful tool because they can ask it to provide a list of peer-reviewed articles, or it can kind of ask what are some current questions in the field that they're interested in, and just kind of come up with ideas. And then they take that information and they start exploring. And if it came up with stuff that doesn't exist, that's fine, it doesn't matter, because they're gonna kind of go further into it and dig deeper. So that's the starting point. And then along the way, there is what I call the gray zone, because using Gen AI as a tutor can be amazing. So you can take a paragraph or an article or something, put it into Gen AI and ask it to explain things in a simple way. And it can do a really good job, but also it sometimes does make mistakes. And so that is a place where we will point out that you want to have an expert in the loop, or a human in the loop, or refer to sources that you know are reliable as you're kind of using it for that kind of interaction. Then there is addressing project questions, which I'm going to elaborate on in the next slides. And then towards the end, when the students already sort of have all the content in place and they just need to fine-tune it and to make sure that the flow is good, and the synonyms, and like all that kind of like just retouching and making it kind of more professional. Again, Gen AI can be incredibly powerful and useful, and we encourage them to use it for that. As I mentioned, one of the goals for the exposing them to Gen AI is to improve familiarity. So a lot of the students are by now obviously familiar with it, but we also want to make sure that they get the most out of this tool. And so in this movement analysis project, when they are describing the movement, one of the sections that they need to do is to describe 3 common errors of a movement. So if we're, for example, talking about like this jump that I showed the image of, and they need to analyze this jump, they need to make sure that they're describing 3 errors. So maybe the person wasn't leaning enough forward, or maybe they're using a different group of muscles, or whatever. And in order to come up with that list of 3 errors, they will do a literature review and kind of evaluate and kind of do that. So that's them doing the independent literature review. Then I tell them, ask Gen AI to do this literature review for you, or ask the Gen AI to come up with 3 errors. And when we're telling them to do that, we say, well, how you ask Gen AI really is important. So make sure that you're providing the information to the Gen AI that will get you the best answer. So you need to ask, to tell the Gen AI who you are, what's your target audience, what's the goal of this thing, what's the context of the assignment, what information you're looking for, and that will kind of help with getting the best answer. And then once you have those kind of 2 pieces, we ask the students to evaluate the use of the Gen AI. So we're going to say, do you agree with that list of the 3 things that the Gen AI came up with? Did changing the prompt change the results of the Gen AI? Did you learn any new ideas that you didn't think of? Did it present any information that was incorrect as facts? And so we asked them to kind of critically think about this whole process and basically evaluate the benefits and limitations of using it in that, for that specific sections, and we do that in a few different sections. So to summarize, we encourage the students to use Gen AI. We want them to do it in a very we provide clear guidelines as to like when is appropriate and inappropriate. And so kind of summarizing it, we want them to use it to explore topics, or otherwise called brainstorming. We want them to use it to address the project questions, which I just described, to improve the flow and clarity of and synonyms, fine-tuning of language, maybe some images depending on what they are. And then don't use Gen AI to learn anatomy or to create anatomical images, at least not today. Maybe tomorrow it'll be better. What I didn't talk about yet is homework. So one of the things that we do in the class is they do also need to kind of assimilate some of the content. And one way of doing it is reading the material of the class and then answering some questions. If they take those questions and they plug it into Gen AI and then it spits the answers, that's kind of bypassing the learning, so that's obviously something that we say clearly, do not do that, that's not helpful. And also, do not use Gen AI to write personal reflections. If I'm asking you to give your opinion about your experience or how you're interacting with class material, obviously don't use Gen AI for that. And just to go back to that gray zone, it can be a pretty expansive zone, so you tread with caution. When you are using Gen AI as a tutor or kind of interacting with it about like highly professional, accurate knowledge, understand that it sometimes can be amazing, but it also can make mistakes. And just one example of a mistake that it did make in this context, the students had to come up with a list of exercises for a person that had an ankle sprain. And the Gen AI recommended to do fibularis muscles stretching, lengthening, and that would be, for the common ankle sprain, that would be the exact opposite of what is actually necessary. And so luckily, the framing of that was compare your answers to the Gen AI, and the students actually realized that that was wrong, and they basically were able to point out. But if you just kind of take that, and because of the fact that students they might be in a place where they don't know if the information is inaccurate or incomplete, and so like that's kind of where they need to be a little bit careful.
Good morning, hello. Thank you for having me. I'll begin by saying I get to teach in my favorite kind of formal learning environment. I know everybody has one. It is the liberal arts seminar. It is my favorite for many reasons, philosophically and pedagogically, but important to today's theme, flourishing together, and to the exercise I'll share with you, I want to emphasize how much I love that the seminar calls for collective learning. We arrive in class not as disembodied minds, ready to report on our independently held intuitions and beliefs, but as whole and complicated people with situated knowledges. And through discussion, reflection, and provocation, we co-construct knowledge together. Knowledge that only we can create as a unique set of minds tackling the questions at hand. I teach 2 sections of this course, this quarter, Making of the Modern World. I teach them back to back. And each class arrives somewhere new. They pull on different threads in the readings. They draw on the backgrounds and experiences and interests of the people in the room. Each class, I like to say, has its own alchemy. And this changes on any given day. Not every session is mind-blowing. Stanford students famously have a lot of responsibilities. They often come to class very visibly tired, stressed, and maybe even, understandably, not in the mood to do what the seminar calls them to do. With so many variables, it is unwieldy, the seminar. So I try to regularly bring my students into awareness of what we're up to, of how exciting it can be to learn with and from one another, and of the genuinely high aspirations we're setting for a mind-opening discussion. The first thing I do each quarter is a norm-setting exercise to design our seminar's social contract, political philosopher, with 2 guiding questions. The first question is, what makes a good discussion? And the second is, what makes a good discussant? I asked them to answer on 2 registers, in principle and in particular, because what one might say makes a good discussion can be different from what you value in a good discussion. What makes you feel intellectually safe, willing to share your ideas, confident that you'll be received with warmth and curiosity by your peers. Talk of discussants often begins with what students feel is obvious. They say things like, good discussants are open-minded. They are respectful of difference. They aren't arrogant. They don't attack persons, even as they criticize ideas. They do the readings. Somebody always says that, and I'm always grateful. I find this a helpful starting point to delineate expectations by imagining individual discussants. But of course, no one participates in isolation. They're situated in a community of knowers where everyone has a responsibility to not only pursue their individual learning, but also contribute to this collective learning endeavor in the seminar. So when we shift our orientation to this relational structure to see what's happening among epistemically interdependent knowers, we widen the possibilities for understanding what we philosophers call different forms of epistemic participation, both what they are and why they are uniquely valuable. So by epistemic participation, I mean the intellectual practices that allow members of the class to contribute to shared learning and knowledge-creating processes. These intellectual practices bring the seminar into being. They make collective learning possible. And as I'll show shortly, I organize them into a set of some of what I think are the most important ones for intellectual flourishing in my classes. I call them Discussant Archetypes. And I share them with my students as a meta-reflective exercise so that each one of them can begin to develop a self-conception as a discussant, one that will manifest differently across learning contexts and one that will change, probably significantly, over the course of their college educations. But I can't yet talk about the exercise without problematizing my very romantic portrait of the liberal arts seminar. Of course, US higher education operates under non-ideal conditions. Unequal educational opportunities before college mean that Stanford students have trained in participatory, discussion-based learning environments, exposing them to the ruling norms of elite liberal arts education. And some others feel very alienated by this space. More specifically, in historically and predominantly white institutions, social inequalities can give rise to a literature that I do a lot of work in, what we call epistemic injustice, where students can be wronged specifically in their capacities as knowers. For example, if their credibility is misevaluated in class as a result of prejudice rather than the substance of their expressed ideas. If a seminar is persistently epistemically alienating, some students might choose, with good reason, to remain silent, a choice that could affect their success in the course or turn them away from a subject of study that they might otherwise love if the seminar were structured differently. And regardless of what they decide to study, they might be left with an unfair sense of inadequacy. So these are exactly the concerns of some of the philosophers I cite in my dissertation. One of them is Emmeline Davis, who describes her own experience navigating our field of philosophy and its very narrow expectations of excellent epistemic participation, of excellent inquiry. And what comes out of a very brilliant criticism she writes is what I take to be a philosophical and pedagogical call to action, to reimagine and pluralize the forms of epistemic participation that are cultivated and celebrated in the classroom, the place where students forge their relationships with humanistic inquiry. By design, the seminar favors the outspoken. It thrives on active participation, but my contention is that we as instructors can appreciate a wider set of epistemic practices that have participatory value, if only we know what to look for. And more, students can demystify what makes a good discussant by getting clearer about their own strengths across a variety of forms of epistemic participation. So I offer them what I call an open typology of discussant archetypes. This is just a sample. I have 14 on a handout that's here. And I ask them to read through it and notice where they see themselves, or where they would like to see themselves, or where they see others they admire. And across these different forms of epistemic participation that I describe, I try to do two things. One is demonstrate that there are lots of different ways to express yourself. There are lots of different ways to convey ideas or be a member of a discussion. And the other thing I want them to be very clear about is that in thinking about archetypes, I'm not encouraging them to think of intellectual essences as if these are fixed to their being. These are intellectual practices, ones that they can test out, ones that might vary by context, even between smaller or larger group discussions. And these are some of the reflection questions that I give them. So, as I said, in the spirit of collective learning, they don't just enact these practices for their own good or for their own reward in class. They do them in relation. And so important to the set of questions is not just asking about their own self-identification, their own goals, where they'd like to go with their participation, but also who they vibe with, who complements them in discussion. If they have strengths, if they have assets that they want to be recognized in the class, how are those assets drawn out by others? And how can they draw out the assets of others? So that's part of the discussion that we have all together. And I do emphasize that it's an open typology. I don't claim to have the exhausted set of epistemic practices that are valuable in a liberal arts seminar. Context and culture will necessarily call us to revisit that question. And I conclude by asking them how they think of themselves and if there's anything missing from the typology. In fact, my winter quarter class helped me grow the typology by adding some epistemically distinct contributions. So I'll close in sharing a few of the highlights of doing this exercise. I do it to set a stage and to give them a sense of the purpose of the seminar. And because we are in it together, we rise and fall together, I want to encourage their self-awareness as developing discussants. I also see them setting very concrete goals. I check in with them with evaluations, and they often say, I'm working on my bridge building. I'm working on my contrarian takes to be daring. It also gives them some common ground. As we know, students arrive in the seminar classroom with different exposure to the expectations and different willingness to take the lead or help set the tone. So giving them some common vocabulary is helpful. And really important to my view is that, like I said, this isn't just for individual reward. I always tell my students, when you contribute to class, you are not the only one who benefits. We all benefit, and that's how we advance collective learning. So thank you.
So today I'm excited to tell you about an activity that I had the opportunity to develop when I was teaching my own introductory chemistry course. And this activity was implemented at the Asian University for Women. This is an international university in Chattogram, Bangladesh. They draw students from almost 20 different countries, mostly in South Asia. And I had the opportunity to teach introductory chemistry at this university. So I was able to design my own curriculum. And whenever I'm teaching, I always ask my students what they're excited about. Usually when I'm teaching chemistry, I get a resounding chorus of, I'm a pre-med, which is great because it helps me develop examples and highlight the influence of chemistry on human health, which is also something that I'm passionate about. But my students at the Asian University for Women really surprised me. They all said that they were excited about art. And there had been a holiday the week before I arrived, and many of them still had celebratory mehendi, which is henna, the art of applying henna to your hands or other skin. And they were excited to show me and to tell me about it. So I thought, we can work with this. And so I developed an activity to teach the chemistry of henna. And throughout my slides, you'll see some chemical reactions and some chemical structures. If that's not your speed, don't worry about it. But if it is your speed, they're there for reference. So as it turns out, henna is prepared from the dried and crushed leaves of the henna shrub, Lawsonia inermis. The active molecule that works as a dye in henna is called lawsone. Its official chemical name is 2-hydroxy-1,4-naphthoquinone. And I explained the chemistry of the extraction and of the molecule, and then I gave my students the opportunity to do some hands-on learning and to apply henna to their hands and to their classmates' hands. One thing that was really great about this activity is that it was super affordable. So this costs less than 25 cents per student, and it doesn't require access to any laboratory facilities. I started out by showing my students this molecule and asking them to identify functional groups. It was an introductory chemistry course, so they were new to organic chemistry, so it was a good opportunity for them to practice pattern recognition. And then we talked about how this dye reacts with your skin. And it forms a bond with a protein called keratin that's abundant in the hair, skin, and nails. And what I highlighted to my students here is that one participant in this reaction is this H+, that's acid. And I asked my students what they thought about it. And many of them said that their mothers and their grandmothers would squeeze lemon juice on their hands after applying henna. And so I was able to point out that that's not just superstitious or family practice, but actually providing the necessary reagents to enable this chemical reaction to occur. I wanted to make this adaptable, and so this was what I presented to my introductory chemistry students, but for a biochemistry course, you could focus on the structure of keratin and the cysteine residues, which are the amino acids that provide that sulfur group that's available to bond with this lawsone dye. For an organic chemistry class, you could have students practice their reaction mechanisms. And what happens actually is that this is not the only interesting reaction when you apply henna to your hands. So after it binds to the keratin in your skin, it then oxidizes. So I asked my students to identify which carbons were oxidized, and I pointed out that this is associated with a visible change. So immediately after you remove henna paste from your skin, it's an orange or red color, but several hours and days later, it darkens into this deep brown color. If you were teaching an advanced general chemistry course, this provides an opportunity to have students monitor reaction kinetics. So they can come up with a numerical score for the color, and by looking at how that color changes over time, they can identify the kinetics of the reaction. So I did this myself. It's a first-order reaction. The half-life is between 3 and 4 hours. And what's amazing about this is it provides an opportunity for students to quantitatively monitor reaction kinetics, where they don't need any fancier instrumentation than their own eyes. I wanted to know what my students thought about this, and so I asked them about a year after the course was completed, how much chemistry they learned from the activity, how it influenced their interest in the way that chemistry impacts the world around us, and how meaningful was it. This is the least disgruntled group of students ever. They rated this on a scale of 1 to 5. For each of these questions, the median score was a 5 out of 5. The mean ranged from 4.2 to 4.5. So overall, they were reporting really positive learning outcomes and positive associations with the activity. I also left a free response at the end of the survey for students to share what they remembered from this activity or from anything throughout the course. And one of my students said, "Since my childhood, I'm very interested in henna. In our last class, I got to know that chemistry impacts our everyday life. Everything around us is about chemistry," which was really beautiful, really meaningful for me to read, because this is what I want my students to learn, that whether or not they want to be chemists, chemistry is all around us. We are all doing it all the time, and it can actually be really beautiful if you take a moment to appreciate it. So in summary, I was able to create this activity that was really affordable and accessible, didn't require access to laboratory facilities. It was adaptable to a variety of different chemistry courses, and my students found it engaging and meaningful. My students got to practice their organic chemistry and identifying functional groups and understanding oxidation reactions, and to appreciate the impact of chemistry on the world around them. And I learned the importance of catering to student interests and asking them what they care about, and also the significance of representation in the classroom. My students were really surprised and excited to see something that was culturally meaningful and relevant to them presented as an area of academic interest and exploration. I want to acknowledge that I was able to do this as a first-time instructor. I was building a new curriculum, and I had a lot of flexibility. But one thing that I want to leave you guys with to reflect on is this idea of leaving space in our curricula to adapt to the changing interests of our students over time. So how can we build in flexibility to allow us to create new activities and to make sure that we are catering to our students' active interests? And with that, I want to thank my lab mates who provided an initial sounding board for this, and also to thank the folks at the Asian University for Women, including my amazing students who participated in this activity. And thank you for your attention.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. My name is Enze. I am a lecturer in the Material Science and Engineering department, and today I want to share some of my observations from a class I taught last quarter on visual communication in science. Also, thanks to the conference organizers for this opportunity to present. So I want to start by acknowledging some of the people who made this work possible. Certainly my students in Math Sci 122, who are a joy to work with and whose work you will see featured later today. I want to thank my friends and mentors for teaching me a lot about visualization. And in keeping with the conference theme, I want to thank some of the faculty across campus, as you can see, who gave me ideas for what to teach in this course. And so by the end of the talk, I hope you can take away maybe these two things or something else that's more relevant to you. This first learning goal is regarding a creative use of generative AI for students. And then the second is just more generally how maybe we can include interactive learning components for student engagement and assessment. In preparing this course, a motivating question I had was the following: instead of having educators create these representations of concepts, can we empower students and equip them with the tools to let them do it themselves? I think this has many benefits. Maybe chief among them is where this exercise sits in Bloom's taxonomy, right there at the top. So for some context, this is the outline of our course. It's separated into 3 units with some example topics listed in each one. At the end of each unit, the students complete the summative assessment where they have to use open source tools to build some creative projects. Big emphasis of the course is building. It's an engineering course. And so today I will just focus on this third project here. In this project, students started by selecting a topic from introductory material science or a core class in their discipline. And then they had to build an interactive tool to teach this topic visually to other students. You can imagine that such a tool could then be used by instructors, maybe, in their own courses. So instead of me designing the tool, suddenly I have like this army of undergrads designing tools. And then I should say by interactivity, there's many forms. We're specifically referring to digital interactivity. So most students wrote really complex code to realize their artistic vision. And so if we think about how, there's a lot of tools out there. I think many of you may know like PhET from Carl Wyman here as like an example. And there's been a lot of research showing the effectiveness for teaching and learning using these interactive tools. But if we look at how they're typically designed, in the traditional structure, you have this seasoned instructor with deep PCK, computing expertise, and we all know, even if you have all those things, you don't have the time to actually go do this. And that's really sad, and the students are kind of just left to kind of digest this themselves. But what we found is that maybe this tide is shifting. So students, they know a lot, and they know kind of what works well for them. So instead of having an instructor guess at what an effective representation would be for the average student, maybe we can just have students learn how to co-create the curriculum themselves. Of course, this would require domain knowledge, but then again, domain knowledge is what we're trying to teach in our courses, so that piece will be there, hopefully. And then now, the big difference is the time investment has shifted. So instead of spending hours writing the code yourself, you're maybe querying generative AI, like we heard from Tamar's talk. And then, because these students, when I surveyed them, most had very basic coding experience. So I designed some scaffolded labs. We only have 10 weeks. But otherwise, I told them they could use generative AI however much they needed. And indeed, thanks to some black box computing wizardry, the students created quite complex code to finish their projects. So let's see what this looks like. So one of the topics we try to teach in undergraduate material science is this idea of material selection, selecting the right material given your application and set of constraints. there's a lot of factors to consider, and a lot of this data is usually buried inside text or tables. And so these students created this interactive tool that allowed you to look at materials, their properties, and adjust these sliders to create this sort of visual representation, this visual chart at guiding material selection, looking at this optimal region in which that you can choose materials. And so this was really compelling. This actually is pretty similar to state-of-the-art industry software, but the students could reproduce the UI just using open source tools and maybe 15 to 20 hours of work, which I think is pretty reasonable for a final project. This next example, exploding head emoji, is even more mind-blowing, I think. So I'm a computational material scientist, and when you work with materials data, a lot of the materials data out there, whether it's measured or computed, is at equilibrium. The world, however, would be a very boring place if everything was in equilibrium. And so this student wanted to create a database, a visual representation of material properties under extreme conditions. Specifically, she wanted to combine structure visualization with interactive data tables and graphs so that when you click on the individual points in the graph, it loads new data and a new structure that you can then go in and drag. This is pretty complex, as you can see, but also what you can see is that the interface generated with the help of LLMs is quite clean and elegant and integrated. In my opinion, this example is compelling, not just because it's new science, but also a new way of looking at science. Right? Students can explore data and create individualized interactive learning opportunities in a way that I think is simply inconceivable even a short time ago. And so hopefully these examples give you a sense of sort of how these creative projects can be effective for promoting teaching and learning. I want to conclude with a few quick impressions. So one thing is that we benefited in this course because the coding and the learning were decoupled, which was also kind of new. What I mean by this is students, of course, have written code before, but that was usually for the context of learning computer science or data science. But here the focus is on visual communication of just any science. And so the fact that we used LLMs was totally fine, and I think the students could still feel proud that the unique product that they created. This gave a chance to really showcase the students' creativity and agency. A lot of the projects that they picked were things unfamiliar to me, so I had a lot of fun learning from my students and just seeing the creative ways to use these tools. I should also say these projects were not perfect. Even the end product, it's certainly not the initial drafts. Iteration was a big part of this course, and actually it's a big part of using generative AI effectively. And so we just continue to iterate, and I think in terms of formative assessments, I got to visually and literally see my students' thinking and growth in real time as they iterated on these final versions. Speaking of time, I don't want to deceive any of you. This is certainly still a large time commitment. Of course, now you have to iterate constantly with the generative AI, and then I often had to sit in maybe at the very end to help them debug like the really crafty bugs. I will say, I love debugging, and we had a ton of fun, but your mileage may vary. Okay, and so with that, I'll leave it there. I hope you found something interesting to take away and thinking about how you can involve students in your own curriculum co-creation processes. I think it is a beautiful way to flourish together.